Europe's energy system is changing rapidly. Over the last 2 decades, renewable energy has become a central part of electricity generation across the continent. But this transition has not happened equally everywhere. Countries like Denmark, Germany, and Spain have invested heavily in renewable infrastructure, and today they generate a large share of their electricity from wind, solar, and hydropower. But among these countries, one smaller nation stands out: Portugal. Over the past 20 years, Portugal has gone through one of the fastest renewable energy transitions in Europe. In the early 2000s, renewables represented only a relatively small part of Portugal's electricity mix. Today, renewable sources often generate more than 70% of the country's electricity, and in some periods, that number becomes even higher. Portugal's growth becomes even more noticeable when compared to other European countries. Germany remains Europe's largest economy, but despite massive investment into renewable energy, Germany still faces some of the highest industrial electricity prices in Europe. Portugal, meanwhile, benefits from lower renewable generation costs due to geography, climate, and available natural resources. While Germany relies heavily on industrial-scale grid balancing and energy imports, Portugal's renewable conditions are naturally favorable. Portugal is not one of Europe's largest economies, but it does have several structural advantages in the energy transition. First, geography. Portugal benefits from strong Atlantic wind conditions and high solar exposure. These conditions are ideal for renewable energy generation. Second, hydropower. Portugal's river systems provide an important source of relatively stable electricity generation. And third, available space. Compared to many densely populated parts of Western Europe, Portugal has more flexibility for large-scale renewable projects. Today, Portugal's electricity mix is heavily dominated by renewable sources. Hydropower remains an important baseline source of electricity. Wind energy contributes a major share of generation, and solar power has expanded rapidly over the last decade. Together, these renewable systems now form the core of Portugal's electricity network. But Portugal's long-term ambitions go beyond solar panels and onshore wind farms. One of the country's most important future projects is offshore wind development in the Atlantic Ocean. Offshore wind refers to wind turbines installed at sea, where wind conditions are often stronger and more consistent than on land. And Portugal's Atlantic coastline gives it significant long-term potential in this area. The Portuguese government has already identified offshore development zones along the western coast. Early auction processes have started, and long-term estimates suggest that Portugal could eventually support up to 10 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity. If these projects are developed successfully, offshore wind could become one of the most important parts of Portugal's future electricity system. Portugal is also entering a sector that is becoming increasingly important across Europe. Countries like the United Kingdom, Denmark, and the Netherlands have already invested heavily into offshore wind infrastructure. Offshore wind is considered strategically important because turbines at sea typically generate more stable and consistent electricity compared to many land-based systems. Portugal now hopes to become part of this broader Atlantic energy network. However, there are also major limitations. Portugal's electricity grid is relatively small compared to larger European economies, and perhaps more importantly, Portugal remains heavily dependent on interconnections through Spain and France. This creates a structural bottleneck. Even if Portugal produces large amounts of renewable electricity, exporting that electricity to the rest of Europe is not always easy. Renewable energy also creates another challenge: variability. Solar and wind generation change constantly depending on weather conditions, which means Portugal still requires backup generation, storage systems, and stronger grid balancing infrastructure. Europe also faces a broader structural problem. The continent wants to reduce emissions, lower energy prices, and maintain industrial competitiveness at the same time. Achieving all three simultaneously is proving increasingly difficult. This is one reason why cheap renewable electricity is becoming economically important. Industries such as hydrogen production, data centers, and advanced manufacturing require enormous amounts of electricity. Countries capable of producing relatively cheap renewable power may become increasingly attractive for future industrial investment. Portugal is also investing in green hydrogen projects. The concept is relatively simple. Renewable electricity can power electrolyzers, which split water into hydrogen and oxygen. That hydrogen can then potentially be used in heavy industry, shipping, or future energy infrastructure. Although the sector remains early stage, many European governments view hydrogen as a possible long-term energy solution. Because of these limitations, Portugal is unlikely to become a dominant energy exporter on the scale of major global energy producers. But that may not be necessary. Instead, Portugal's future role is more likely to be part of a wider interconnected European energy system, a regional production node, one that contributes renewable electricity, supports future hydrogen production, and helps diversify Europe's energy infrastructure. Portugal alone will not solve Europe's energy challenges, but as Europe continues moving toward renewable electricity, countries with strong natural conditions and scalable infrastructure may become increasingly important, and Portugal appears to be positioning itself as one of them.